it will make his case an example of how we can come together to take violent criminals off the street and to make our communities safer. Legend's mother and father are here, and when I met her in Washington, I promised Sharon that Legend's death would not be in vain, and he will inspire us to greater efforts to make Kansas City safe. And Sharon said that she also strongly supported expanding our efforts beyond Kansas City so that other communities around the country can be made safer. So I'm here today with not only Tim, the U.S. Attorney here in Kansas City, but the Deputy Director of the FBI, David Bowditch, who was instrumental in launching Operation Legend. And the other U.S. attorneys from Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Cleveland, Memphis, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and Albuquerque. They're deeply committed to this operation, and we have some encouraging early results. To start, I'd like to put things in a bit of context. The most basic duty of government is to provide for the safety of the community. In 1991 and 1992, first time I was Attorney General, violent crime rate that year was at an all-time high in the United States. It's never been higher. And for the 3 decades leading up to that year, violent crime had tripled in the United States. At that time, we made the decision in the federal government to dramatically increase our role to focus on combating violent crime. And we launched a series of initiatives focused on drugs, drug organizations, gangs, and gun offenders. And we also expanded our close collaboration with state and local law enforcement.
Xin chào mọi người. Bộ trưởng Tư pháp Hoa Kỳ, ông
these violent offenders and predators. And over the next 25 years, the crime has steadily
Bộ trưởng Tư pháp Hoa Kỳ đang có cái cuộc họp báo nói về chiến dịch chống tội ác, chiến dịch Operation Legend ở thành phố Kansas City. Chiến dịch này là để kỷ niệm, tưởng niệm bắt nguồn từ một cậu bé 4 tuổi tên là Legend bị giết. Từ đó mới ra chiến dịch này cách đây vài tuần. Và hiện nay thì chiến dịch rất là thành công, đang được áp dụng mở rộng thêm 9 thành phố khác.
This could be a bad year for violent crime and arrest a trend that, as I say, has been going on for almost 30 years. This spike may have a lot of reasons behind it. I think some of it may be the pent-up aggression prompted by state and local quarantine orders. I definitely feel a lot of it is due to the premature release of dangerous criminals by the courts and by prosecutors. And I think it's related to the efforts that we've recently seen to demonize police and to defund their work. Operation Legend is the heart of the federal government's response to this upturn in violent crime. Its mission is to save lives, solve crimes.
Cái chiến dịch này là cái phản ứng của chính phủ đối với lại cái việc tội phạm đang gia tăng.
Rather than demonizing and defunding our police, we are supporting and strengthening our law enforcement partners.
Ông cho biết thay vì là cắt giảm ngân sách cảnh sát thì ngược lại, chính phủ đang làm cái điều ngược lại để mà có thể giảm cái vấn đề tội phạm.
Consultation and jointly with our state partners as to whether it makes more sense to pursue a case through the state prosecution system or through the federal system. And so prisoners are charged in both under this operation. Of those arrested, we have charged more than 200 for federal crimes.
Với chiến dịch này thì trong thời gian qua đã bắt được bắt được và truy tố tội hình 200 tội phạm.
To keep violent criminals in pretrial detention. They're just let right out on the street again. But in the federal system, we have a better ability to hold on to violent offenders, keep them in custody, pending disposition of their.
Với cái chiến dịch này và của liên bang liên quan do đó thì không có dễ dàng mà thả những cái người bị bắt ra, mà sẽ có những cái kế hoạch để mà truy tố và giữ họ lại.
But the essential ingredient for it is that the community feels safe when they're dealing with the police and they're providing information to the police. And what typically happens is that where there is no pretrial detention and people in the community feel that the criminals are going to be right back out on the street within hours, they're extremely hesitant to work closely with the police.
Một khi mà người dân nghĩ rằng là tội phạm bắt rồi thả ra đó thì người dân sẽ rất là khó khăn để mà hợp tác với cảnh sát.
We're stepping forward so that we can help keep some of these offenders off the streets.
Do vậy là chúng tôi phải bước tới để mà có thể giữ những cái bọn tội phạm ở trong tù không có thả lại ngược ra xã hội.
Do not incapacitate these violent criminals long enough, and do not provide a deterrent, and do not encourage them to cooperate once they're captured. And in the federal system, we have very strong sentences for violent crimes, and that helps us get further information from these offenders. And criminals know that. They know that the federal system means business, and we're putting them out.
Và chính bọn tội phạm cũng biết được như vậy, cũng biết được rằng là hệ thống của liên bang sẽ làm việc, không có thả họ ra dễ dàng.
Pause and say there've been a number of photographs of guns appearing on this screen, and one of the important developments of Legend has been the seizure of hundreds and hundreds of firearms in our Legend cities. Here in Kansas City, I think 78 firearms have been seized, and as you can tell, these are not pop.
Với chiến dịch này thì đã tịch thu được rất là nhiều những cái vũ khí bất hợp pháp.
Huge magazines, drum magazines. So getting them off the street is saving lives.
Tịch thu nhiều vũ khí và băng đạn khỏi đường phố thì nó an toàn hơn.
So our work is just getting started. There's no more important mission for the Department of Justice than keeping our communities safe. And through this operation, we're going to continue working with our state and local partners.
Với cái chiến dịch Legend này thì chúng tôi sẽ làm việc hơn nữa với lại tiểu bang và thành phố. Và người mẹ của cậu bé tên là Legend sẽ có một vài câu nói chuyện chia sẻ với chúng ta lát nữa đấy.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. Rick Smith, Kansas City, Missouri Police Chief. You know, this morning as we were going through some things with the Attorney General, one thing became noticeable as we walked through our cases is that we wouldn't have solved the cases as timely as we had, and we wouldn't have suspects in custody without our federal partnerships. When I turned to the Attorney General, I said,
ông này là ở tiểu bang Kansas, sở cảnh sát của tiểu bang Kansas, của thành phố Kansas City của tiểu bang Kansas. Ông nói rằng là nếu mà không có sự trợ giúp của liên bang thì khó mà có thể bắt cũng như là truy tố những cái tội phạm nếu mà không có cái chiến dịch này, nên ông rất là cảm ơn cái sự hợp tác của liên bang. Đây là người mẹ của cậu bé 4 tuổi bị chết mà khiến tạo ra cái chiến dịch chống tội phạm Operation Legend này đó. Và cảm ơn cái liên bang cũng như cảm ơn cộng đồng đã cung cấp rất nhiều những cái đầu mối để mà có thể bắt được bọn tội phạm.
go ahead and give them a call so we can help solve other murders like my son, because I know we have had a lot.
Bà nói nếu ai có những đầu mối về tội ác thì nên báo cho cảnh sát để mà có thể bắt được, giảm lại những cái vụ tội phạm như là cái vụ giết con của bà.
Yes, I have beginning to get justice for my son, but I also want to make sure I help everyone out that I can so we can get justice for you guys also. And like I said, I want to thank every single person that had a helping hand into solving my son's case. The blood, the sweat, the tears, I appreciate it. I thank you. And like my family,
Bà cũng cảm ơn rất nhiều những người mà liên quan trực tiếp giải quyết cái điều tra cái vụ con của bà bị giết chết, cậu bé 4 tuổi, người da đen đó.
We have a light weight lifted off of us, and I appreciate everyone, and I thank you.
Tôi cảm ơn tất cả mọi người.
So with that, I'm glad to take some questions.
Bây giờ tôi sẽ nhận vài câu hỏi.
Well, there have been efforts addressed to trying to figure out what the root causes of violent crime are and to address them, and they've been going on, for 70, 80 years. The Department of Justice, the enforcement agencies, our primary responsibility is to deal with crime. The social conditions that contribute to crime,
Bộ Tư pháp của chúng tôi là chủ yếu là làm việc với cái vấn đề tội ác đấy.
Agency should be focused on. Now, the police have been called upon recently to do more and more work in areas where other professions and other agencies have sort of let the ball drop. So increasingly, police have to deal with mental illness, homelessness, drug addiction, and they have been taking on that burden to some extent. But in terms of sort of broad questions about people's argumentativeness and social conditions that make it contribute to crime, the government has been working on that and spending trillions and trillions of dollars over the years on that. And one point I've always made is none of this money spent, none of the educational efforts, none of the vocational efforts or activities, recreational activities, can bear fruit in an atmosphere where there's blood flowing on the street. One of the things that's always concerned me is it's always been presented as usually presented as a dichotomy, which is, let's attack the root causes versus those who are actually committing crimes. And it can't be a dichotomy because none of the efforts to rehabilitate communities can bear fruit in an atmosphere of bloodshed. So the first step, in my view, is to provide safety to the community, and that's the job of law enforcement.
Ông là cái nói rằng là phải cung cấp cái môi trường an toàn thì có thể cho cộng đồng thì cộng đồng có thể làm việc với lại cảnh sát để mà hợp tác với cảnh sát.
I'm not sure. Where's Justin? Yeah, Justin, do you know that?
As you know, the marshals have been very active. As you know, the marshals have been very active in making arrests on fugitives. And so our expectation is when somebody is a fugitive and they're returned on a warrant, we stand a much better chance in our state or federal court of having that person detained. But we don't have an exact number for you at the moment, but we can work on getting that for you. So that's a very complicated question because there's so many different courts that are in play, but we're working on an answer for it. It's a good question, but we'll get you an answer.
The one thing I didn't mention is, in addition to the arrests, we had the marshals apprehending fugitives, and we have apprehended, as part of Operation Legend, over 1,000 fugitives.
Ngoài ra cái việc mà bắt rất là nhiều từ cái chiến dịch này bắt tội phạm thì cũng còn có thêm nữa là có những cái lệnh truy nã đối với lại cái bọn tội phạm nữa.
Because as far as I know, there was no federal offense involved in that. Is that correct?
Anna Lương, ý kiến của bạn rất hay. Cảm ơn bạn. Cảm ơn bạn. Quang
The
Trung.
federal code has a number of laws that if you break it, it's a federal offense, and state law otherwise governs. But
Các bạn nhớ bấm subscribe á, thì khi mà có những cái cuộc họp báo bất ngờ như thế này mới mở lên xem kịp.
Right. So I'm going to ask the deputy director to comment on that. But let me just say generally what I was trying to describe to you is these are task forces where you have both state and federal officers working cases.
Ai đang xem mà quên coi lại coi chưa bấm subscribe thì bấm liền.
As a state case or a federal case. So the federal government will assist state law enforcement as they pursue investigations of state cases. And then sometimes it's found out during that investigation that there has been a federal violation as well, in which case we sometimes charge that as a federal. But as to the specifics in that case, my understanding is that both the FBI and the U.S. Marshals assisted the Kansas City Police. I'm not sure whether Chief Smith or Dave Bowditch would address that.
Well, good question. First off, I think it's important to understand as the
Ông này là cảnh sát trưởng của sở cảnh sát
we work side by side, and when I
Kansas
say
City.
we, I'm talking Department of Justice components to include the ATF, the DEA, the U.S. Marshals, and the FBI. We work side by side with state and local detectives across the country in all the major cities and many of the smaller cities. I'm not going to get into specifics of this particular case because it is now going to be adjudicated. What I will say is it's very common for us to all of us to conduct surveillances, search warrants, interviews, social media exploitation, general court process, and general investigative techniques as part of our task forces that are both joint and federal task forces.
Ông nói rằng là có áp dụng tất cả những cái hình thức để mà có thể bắt bọc tội phạm, như là từ những cái máy quay cho tới việc thẩm vấn tội phạm, cũng như là sử dụng social media để theo dõi vân vân, để có thể bắt được những cái bọn tội phạm nằm trong cái chiến dịch này.
It's my understanding that 5 have been charged.
Chúng ta thấy người mẹ của cậu bé 4 tuổi bị mất đứa con, người mẹ rất trẻ, ở tuổi 20 mấy thôi.
We now have a suspect in that beating. In terms of federal resources,
Và báo chí cũng đã nói nhiều rằng là nếu mà không có cái vụ Operation Legend này thì con bà chết một cách lặng lẽ chứ không có được ồn ào như là cái chết của ông George Floyd. Tại vì nó không có thích hợp với lại cái vấn đề chiến thuật chính trị của ai đó.
Well, I think, I'm pretty confident the evidence will be there, but I think one of the problems we have in the criminal justice system now is revolving door justice, and I think too many criminals. To tell you the truth, during my exposure to the law enforcement community, which goes back over 30 years, there's one constant, which is the police do their job. The police do get the suspect and get the evidence. The system falls apart in the prosecution and trial and sentencing stage. And what's happening these days in the country is we're going back to some of the old practices we followed in the 60s and 70s, where there's revolving door justice and people are not being held. They're not being held before trial when they're dangerous. They're not being sentenced to prison, even though they're violent. So that increasing number of these people have serious criminal history records and they're out on the street. That's the problem. I think if you go to most of these big cities that are experiencing an increase in violent crime, and you go to the police departments, they will know who the shooters are. They will know exactly who the shooters are. And there are not that many of them, relatively speaking. 200-300. But if you took off the streets, you would more than half violent crime. That's my impression. And I'm not necessarily talking just about Kansas City. I'm just talking about all the cities generally.
Ông nói tới vấn đề là tất cả mọi thành phố đều như vậy thôi. Khi ta lấy bớt bọn tội phạm ra khỏi đường phố thì nó sẽ giảm cái mức độ tội phạm, nhưng mà thường thì bị cái vấn đề mà bắt rồi phải thả ra, bắt rồi phải thả ra.
In this sense, I think the mass incarceration has been thrown around, but I was talking about the incarceration of chronic violent offenders, violent criminals, and I hope no one is suggesting that they shouldn't be incarcerated. I think what people refer to as mass incarceration really refers to harsh, long sentences for minor drug distribution or small amounts of drug distribution, which led to a very substantial increase in the prison population. I'm not talking about that now. I'm talking about getting shooters off the street.
Attorney General Barr, can you address people who in the community who say that Operation Legend and things like this are an overreach of the federal government? I mean, there are people in Kansas City, including our mayor and one of our congressmen, at one point who were against Operation Legend coming to Kansas City. Can you address those people?
Sure.
Ông có điều gì nói với người dân về cái vấn đề cái chiến dịch này?
Confusion in the media, some of it not unintentional, confounding two different aspects of law enforcement. One is dealing with civil unrest, rioting, and the other is the classical, traditional work that law enforcement does, finding criminal suspects and prosecuting them. And what Operation Legend deals with is the latter. And we've been doing that in the federal government for decades. As I said, we stepped it up dramatically in the early 90s. But working on violent crime and working with state and local government, that's what the Department of Justice does. And we've done it a long time. And what this is ratcheting it up and targeting at the shooters in selected cities where there's a high homicide or non-fatal shooting rate. I think a lot of that rhetoric came at a time when the narrative, as the press calls it, was in taking shape in Portland, that the federal government was overreaching by going in to suppress demonstrations. And during that, it was in that environment that I think some people made misinformed comments about this law enforcement initiative.
As a follow-up to that question, you know, we've talked about the successes of Operation Legend so far. You all are pulling on Kansas City, as I understand, in September. So what comes after this? Like, how is this operation going to continue to be successful in Kansas City after the 185 people that are here helping pull out?
Well, we're not pulling out of Kansas City in September. I mean, we always will have a strong law enforcement presence here, and it's really a question of adjusting the levels of additional resources that.
Ông nói rằng là cái chiến dịch này sẽ tiếp tục mà không có ngưng ở Kansas City, chỉ có sẽ điều chỉnh cái nhân sự cũng như là tài lực để mà áp dụng ở đây mà thôi.
No, but that's not the revolving door. That's the decision of where they're going to be charged.
Are you implying that the state, local courts or that revolving door is letting people out? Unfortunately, we're looking at doing, a lot of these criminals who may be getting arrested may be getting back on the street, right? I guess it goes back to my earlier question. Are you able to track if these criminals that you're arresting are back on the street?
Yeah, I haven't aggregated them, so I can't give you an overall figure. But when we talk to the U.S. attorneys in the individual jurisdictions, they have a good idea of which cases in the state system are going to be able to stick. And it varies from state to state. I don't want to comment on the degree of revolving door that exists here. I don't know if the chief.
Một lần nữa họ cũng nói nhiều tới cái vấn đề hiện nay là cái khó khăn là trong cái vấn đề đại dịch thì thường bắt vào những cái tội nhỏ phải thả ra, còn những cái tội hình thì giữ lại. Và thả ra thì thường quay lại phạm tội tiếp ở trên đường phố.
I'll just say this on the fugitive warrants, these warrants that we're making arrests in these warrants, these are violent criminal warrants, right? So these are people who are charged with aggravated assault or homicide, very serious crimes. Those tend to be cases that are good candidates for bail in any court system when you're trying to seek detention. When you've returned a fugitive to a court system where they're charged with a homicide or an aggravated assault, you've got a pretty good argument for detention. Certainly in Ohio, that would be the case, which is where I'm from, the U.S. Attorney in Cleveland. Many of these other arrests are fresh state arrests that are made on the same kind of crimes: aggravated assaults, illegal possession of a firearm, large-scale drug trafficking. That's what we're looking at. So those are cases that, on average, are going to stand a much better chance of detention.
Những cái vụ mà thường là sẽ bị bắt giữ như là sở hữu súng ra một cách bất hợp pháp, hoặc là buôn bán thuốc phiện, vân vân.
Well, first of all, our clearance rate, I think this morning is around 60-some%. So I think we're right about the national average, maybe a little bit more. I think what we're seeing here with our assistance is we're getting things done more timely. Things that would take us more time due to resources and manpower wouldn't happen as quick. And just forensically, all kinds of things, analyst staff, other things that are helping us out make the system and our investigations move so much faster than they would have if we did not have the help.
Ông nói rằng với cái sự giúp đỡ của cái chiến dịch Legend này của liên bang đó thì là làm cho những cái việc bắt bớ cũng như là điều tra của thành phố nó nhanh hơn nhiều. Nếu mà không có thì nó cũng có làm thôi, nhưng mà nó không nhanh như thế.
Get access unlawfully to firearms? The answer to that is yes. Okay. Thank you.
Họp báo chấm dứt rồi. Xin chào mọi người nhé.